Yeah, thank you, Igor, for having me here, and Kasia for helping me set up a bunch of things. This talk sort of goes in a few different directions, but when I teach classes, I'm often told that I start with a story and meander around, and eventually I try and bring it back to the larger point that I'm trying to make. I work on polarization and how specifically it's impacting democracy. And the larger thesis of my work is that social media in particular and is contributing to a great deal of polarization that we see in Indian society today. And so, to start with, the agenda of the talk is I'm going to talk about influencing in India and digital polarization, polarization and that's done to digital journalism, and specifically the third topic, which I will get to, which I think is the topic which helps put this all together, is that of political interviewing. Now, let me explain why I have these very strange pictures up here. These are South Indian movie stars playing computer engineers, right? And there's this interesting trend that happened in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, that the lead character in a movie in India, especially South India, would be a software engineer, which is very unusual. If you think about what is a software engineer, you think about dandruff. Suddenly you have these aspirational heroes, men and women, who are software engineers. And this has to do with the way technology is understood in India as something very aspirational and something that you can trust. Coupled with this, we have this unusual situation in India where in the last 5 years specifically, you've had an incredible explosion of access to the internet through mobile devices. And what you have is a generation of people who have come online and are on the internet, and they don't know that they are on the internet. You ask them, do you use the internet? No. Do you use YouTube? Yes. And they have come online without the awareness of the Nigerian scam. I'm not saying Nigerian scam as a way of othering Nigerians, but the fact is it remained the Nigerian scam. There's research on this because only the most gullible people would fall for it. Everybody else knew what it was. So the net result of this is that there is a very different level of understanding of what is authentic, what is believable online. And that's a kind of baseline understanding for where we're going with this. All right, so first up, let me talk about influencing in India and how that's changing. So brief introduction to the data itself that I'll be using. This was data which we started collecting when I was at Microsoft Research. And we did this over several years at Microsoft Research, and then I transitioned to the university system. And then, Elon Musk cut off the data. So it's kind of spotty in places, but what we essentially did was we picked a group of accounts which were known politicians, and we looked at who were part of their network. Then we took all the accounts which were in that network, and we did this iteratively 3 times. And after that, what we went, and if you do it iteratively 3 times, then you have like a list of 1 million accounts, something like that. And then what we did is we kept shaving out accounts which didn't have a great deal of connections to the original sets. By doing that, what you essentially are figuring out that there's homophily between accounts. And then we start looking at the profile text to see whether there are words which suggest they are politicians, stop words, et cetera, et cetera. And by doing this, we built an archive of 55,000 Indian politicians. When I say 55,000 Indian politicians, I mean politicians as well as what are IT cell members from various parties, right? Alongside that, we also built a parallel set of about 19,000 Indian influencers. This is all Twitter data. And what we started, we collected everything that they ever said, ever. Right? At that time, you could use the academic API to just pull everything. And what we were able to do is see when has which politician talked about what topic and which influencer has engaged with that politician, which politician has engaged with the influencer. As a result, we were able to tell what is the polarization of various influencers in Indian society. When I say influencer, I mean journalists, celebrities, sort of movie stars, etc., etc. And based on that, also get an understanding of who's aligned to what party, what topic is aligned to what party, etc., etc. And we'll talk about some of those things down the line. I'm just giving an overview of the data, and now I'll move into the actual talk. Traditional influencers or things like sports persons, movie stars, television anchors, and that kind of thing. And many of these people have now had to also create online presence because that's just the nature of how this business works at this given point of time. There's a new set of influencers who are people in health, food, travel, news, etc. And one important change has happened to the media ecology as a result of this, which is that certain things which would only be mediated through newspapers and magazines. Let's say you have a new restaurant and you want somebody to talk about it. In the old days, you'd like to get a review from a major critic or something like that. That kind of thing does not matter anymore. Now what matters is which influencers you can get to talk about your stuff. And that's just basically been baked into the overall ecology. In India, more importantly, there's also a new space beyond traditional influencers, which is, let's say, these folks who are doing completely new sets of things. So farming influencers, that's a huge space. Farmers who just talk about what they're doing on the farms. Some of them have millions of of followers. Cooking has become a huge space. I mean, I know myself that my own cooking has changed dramatically after YouTube. And there's also what is this new set of unusual influencers. So older persons who do their dance videos and that kind of thing. So influencing is generally a huge part of the Indian media consumption ecology at this given point of time. And if you look at YouTube channels, has anybody here heard of Choo Choo TV? Yeah, people who have children are stuck hearing about Choo Choo TV. Yeah. But YouTube, for instance, about half of their most engaged channels are Indian channels. And there's a very important difference between the way that Indian YouTube influencers work versus the global YouTube influencers, which is that most of the Indian YouTube influencers tend to be what is called brand channels, which is like they have a large amount of content, okay, as opposed to individual channels, non-brand channels, where you have a small amount of content, but that small amount of content gets massive amount of engagement per video, whatever. Our influencer in chief is our prime minister. Okay. Now, this is a set of pictures which came out. If you know a little bit about the history of Narendra Modi, this is the prime minister. Till about 2000, in the early 2000s, he was generally seen as a regional strongman. Okay. And there's a very important kind of branding exercise which goes on for Narendra Modi happening, which starts in the mid 2000s, right? And this is done through the engagement of various advertising agencies to move away from this idea of a political strongman. And this is very important because how do you change your brand image from being a political strongman to being something else? And what is that something else going to be? So let me ask you, what do you find interesting about these pictures? This ad agency put out these pictures. This is before he's prime minister.
Why teeth? A goose?
Yeah. Why?
Is it humanizing?
They're humanizing him, but there's something specific about that bird. Besides the fact that you can't actually take a picture from this close. It's a white bird. It's a bird of peace. A strong man near a white bird, right? So there's symbolic meaning in that. What else?
Fitness.
He's a fitness. I'm a middle-aged Indian man. We don't do fitness, right? We just basically decline. But here is a man who is different, and he's making a point, and he's not dressed like a politician. Indian politicians, till this point, they would take a picture of themselves in a white kurta. That's the standard. This is a man who is different. He stands for something, all right? There's other stuff going on. He's a man of knowledge because here he is with Obama's book, right? He's got a financial newspaper.
A cup of tea and a laptop.
He's got a cup of tea, right?
Technologically also adept. He's using a.
He's technologically adept. In 2008, he had an Apple laptop. In India, that was a big deal, right? At that time, right? He's a multitasker. He's got this open, this open, this open, right? He's a man of many skills. And he does not get distracted by those, in complete defiance of all literature on multitasking, right? So, and you know, this is like very peaceful surroundings, the misty morning, etc., etc. So there is an attempt here to recreate the person. And this use of imagery has been very standard in the continuation. This is from well before he became prime minister, but it continues. Sometimes it can go overboard. These are his Instagram pictures. This is Narendra Modi near Mount Everest. This is Narendra Modi looking at the eclipse. This is Narendra Modi in a classroom. This photograph went viral. These are all from his Instagram. If you notice carefully, this is not really a window. So actually what happened was this picture was taken inside a container. And this kid and the teacher, they look like they will be shot if they don't have the right expression. And what's interesting here is that you have this building of the idea of the nation, a modern nation, based on technology, which comes repeatedly right from his early phase of how do you reimagine somebody who's a political strongman. You reimagine that person through technology. It is the same thing which helps explain why software engineers were so powerful as a lead character in Indian cinema, to understanding why being a technocrat becomes very important for a political person. Now, this style of influencing has actually stayed consistent with Modi through the years. This is Modi with the terracotta warriors. This is Modi cleaning the beach so that people also keep their surroundings clean. Here is a spread of Narendra Modi's social media presence. So of course he's got Instagram and Twitter. Those are two major platforms which several politicians use. He's got a very important WhatsApp channel, which you can get daily messages on. He's got his own website. On his website, he does daily features of people, social media users. So any one of you could write a tweet that somehow his team finds interesting, and then they'll feature it on the website. He's got a Spotify channel. He's got a Pinterest board. He's on LinkedIn. Anybody here on LinkedIn? Yeah. So what is LinkedIn doing for you right now? Like, are you ready for your next job?
Help you find literature.
Well, but it might help you find another job. Or what is it like? But what the point is that if the people of the country use LinkedIn to show their qualification for why they deserve to do what they do, I'm the prime minister. I'm standing on the same qualifications. I'll show you what I did at every phase of my career. So it's a way of building a resume. He has a YouTube channel with over 100 playlists, not over 100 videos. Each of those playlists have whatever, hundreds of videos. One of those things is his yoga channel, in which he will tell you, if you have a back problem, how can you solve it? I will show you the poses. If you have stress problems, issues with your, I don't know, children, he will tell you how to deal with them. So there's an evolution which social media allows you to go from a political actor to being something more like a guru, like an all-purpose person. And this is something which I argue we are going to increasingly see among political leaders in other parts of the world. In fact, if you saw what Joko Widodo did in Indonesia, there was very interesting parallels between that and the use of social media of creating this kind of all-purpose leader. Now, what has happened is opposition leaders have also realized that, well, it looks like everybody is doing this influencer thing, so we also should go ahead and try and become influencers. So rather than pushing back against this strategy, most opposition have figured out that they need to actually get in with this strategy and try to match the person. So there's a pyramid of influencers, and I'll talk about why these are important. There's basically the top level influencers, which are big politicians, like mainstream celebrities. The important thing about mainstream celebrities and big politicians is that they have a life outside of digital spaces, right? So it's not that their only legitimacy comes from being a digital person. And these people are generally a little bit more careful about what they will say online. And there's a reason for that, right? If you're a big star, you can't just go and say random stuff because your finances come from a range of people. Different people with different political persuasions might watch your movies, right? Then you have the second layer of influencers who are kind of million plus influencers. These are people on Instagram, it's easier to be a million plus than it is, say, on Twitter or something like that. These are people whose social media presence has become important enough that they need to be careful, at least, about what positions they take, because that can push them up or down. And plus, they might not necessarily directly endorse a political party, but they will do certain things which make suggestions, innuendo in favor of a party rather than direct. The next two ranges of influencers are where the most aggressive stuff starts happening. These are like mid-range influencers, YouTubers and Instagrammers who have a significant amount of social media following, but they have the freedom to say aggressive things online without that is going to alienate their viewership. So in the case of India, I'm going to show you a lot of cases where influencers have been systematically built up. Here is a set of what are called anti-separatism influencers. So these are influencers from certain parts of India where there is some amount of say, separatist or separatist movements. Yeah, so these are Kashmiris who are pro-India. So these are influencers who have been built up online. Here is a Sikh person who is anti-Khalistan, right? So those are examples of it. Now you have another new set of people who've come online, which is white practitioners of Hinduism. This is another group of influencers around this space, white pro-India female influencers. You have Pakistan hating Pakistanis. And then you have non-obvious influencers. So a Christian and Muslim influencer who is pro-Narendra Modi, or a military influencer who is pro-opposition. In general, this is a very important thing, and we've done work around this, is that how is the military used in social media discourse? And what we've seen is that a good amount of the nationalist discourse in India and in the US uses people who are military veterans to become their spokespersons, or anybody who's like a random person who says, well, I'm a military veteran and I'm saying this, and the legitimacy that comes with being a military veteran helps you push that agenda a little bit further. And then what I've personally found very, very interesting here is academic influencers. When you build a political movement which is generally seen as populist, one of the problems that the Modi government had up front is that a lot of the serious academics started moving away from associating with the government, especially economists and that like. And so now you have this problem is that what do you do when you created this opinion that all academics are somehow evil, liberal, leftist, whatever comes with it. And there is definitely parallels that we're going to see about this in the next Trump government, which is now you have to build up who are the academics. If none of the academics want to be associated with the Republican Party beyond a certain point, then who are you going to create? And so now there's this new attempt to create what are academics by making them influencers. Interestingly, all the recent chief economic advisors of the Modi government have also had significant influencer accounts online, which is very, very unusual. So in summary, this is the first part of my talk. Can somebody give me a time check? Where am I right now? 125, excellent. Is that influencers are created strategically, and then, I can go into more detail if you have questions about how these influencers are built. Modi's case has enabled a certain kind of professionalization of influencing, how these influencers are often connected to branding and advertising networks. So you can basically go to an advertising agency and say, I want so-and-so level influencer to put out my political message, and they'll find the right influencers for you based on their past activity, etc. And influencing has increasingly become a kind of currency in India and a kind of way to show legitimacy. Importantly, this has become a huge problem for journalism. Why? Because as a journalist now, when you go for a new job for a journalist, you need to start showing how many people follow you on Twitter. Okay, so you need to also have that in your resume. How much value do you bring to my organization by coming and becoming a journalist for me? Simply because the entire media ecology is run by influencing. So, polarization. So, we've all heard news about the level of polarization in Indian society. I'll show us a few examples of the drivers of polarization and specifically the role that YouTube has been playing in journalism and polarization. First, theoretically, what are the major theoretical directions around the research on misinformation and polarization? In the social science literature, there's three broad reasons. One is what is called epistemic reasons for polarization, which is to seek closure on any kind of situation, right? So somebody says something like, well, Indians talk too much. So, oh, yeah, I know why Indians talk too much. And then you give your theory. Your theory is nonsense. But the point is, because that has been thrown at you, you have to say something about it. You don't know what to say, you explain it in whatever way you can. So it's an epistemic reason where you don't know the answer and you come up with something. Okay. The second one is existential reasons, which is when you are somehow afraid for your situation and you come up with reasons for explaining that. That is when misinformation comes about or it grows, and a case in point would be COVID. So there was COVID, the early days of COVID, there was a huge rise in misinformation because people were afraid about what this disease means. Nobody knows. You come up with reasons for that. And that the driver of that, the places where that is more likely to happen is places where people are afraid. And the third and the most prominent reason in today's day is socio-cultural reasons. Here is where misinformation is driven by the need to show your socio-cultural group as somehow superior to the opposing socio-cultural group. Okay, so now this misinformation is that you're more likely to believe it because you've already in your mind made up that that group is a group of bad people. So whatever comes out about them is more worth believing, right? And this is just the general academic literature on it. So now what I'll do is I'll show you a series of graphs on how influencers are polarized in India. This is from the data from Microsoft and Michigan, which I initially talked about. And what we've done over here is we've made a basic polarity score based on simply one factor, which is whether somebody is retweeted, this is Twitter data, by a politician belonging to the ruling party, and then we put every party in the opposition as a binary on the other side, right? So the number of times, so if somebody is one, that means 100% of the times that they've been retweeted by somebody from the ruling party. If they're around zero, then that means that they get equally retweeted by the ruling party and by the opposition party. The size of the bubble is the size of the account, and the number of engagement takes you up and down on the y-axis. Okay, so this is the basic spread, and you're right, is that there has been some movement of this during that period. But in general, at least like if you know Indian news, a lot of this will make a lot of common sense to you, right? So Sudarshan, Republic, these kind of lean this way, NTTV, which before it changed over, leaned this way, etc., etc. What I want to show you, however, is that there's a reasonable spread of accounts over here. There's some number in the middle, but there is some good amount of dots everywhere. There is, however, a little bit more polarization towards the extreme ends. These are all mainstream media channels. Okay. Next, we look at public figures. These are not mainstream media channels. These are public figures who have, these are celebrities, sports persons, etc., who have some kind of a presence outside of social media as well. Okay, and you see maybe a slightly more level of polarization, right? So the middle starts getting emptied out. People generally fall here or here. Yeah, and you're seeing a little bit of spread over here. Now you look at individual journalists. Now you see individual journalists are much more polarized than the news channels that they work for, right? So it's almost like you go into a news channel. Now you select this journalist. I like what this journalist says. And over time, that journalist also starts behaving like their audience, because then they start realizing that my news or whatever I'm covering does better when I take this side or that side. So what I'm suggesting here is that there's a direct relationship with the nature of social media consumption to what a journalist will end up doing over time, because they will start realizing that my audience does better here or there. Okay, so individual journalists more likely to be polarized than news channels themselves. However, even over here, there is some spread. Okay, so there is obviously much higher concentration on the ends. This is the most remarkable of all, is digital influencers. These are people who are digital influencers, but they have no presence outside of their digital influencing. And they are the most polarized. And so if you want the short answer to what really drives polarization in Indian society, the digital influencers, if you're consuming content from digital influencers, that is most likely to be what is pushing you to one or another end. So there isn't a market gap in the middle per se. As it turns out, is that when you say something which is more towards the middle, you get a lot less engagement than when you say things which is towards one of the other to the extreme ends. And this is, of course, like very much in line with the Twitter data, which shows that bad behavior or extreme behavior is more rewarded than non-extreme behavior. So there is some market in the middle, but that market is much smaller than the market that there is at the extremes. So it is, in fact, in their self-interest to be slightly more polarized. I mean, there is, again, there's probably going to be a drop-off when you get too polarized and you get to be ridiculous, but overall. So they actually generally don't retweet each other as much, but they get retweeted by the same networks. Okay, so what typically happens is that there's one very interesting thing that we noticed. When something very extreme needs to be said, or needs to be said, whatever is said, you'll very rarely see a high-level influencer, even among these, actually retweeting it. Except that what they will do is they will retweet it, and after some time, they will unretweet it. Okay. By then, you've put it out. Yeah. Okay, it can go explosive, but you're not in that chain. Yeah. Okay, and what we see here is actually this is exactly to your point, which is that when you're a digital influencer or a journalist, you get way more engagement when your content gets engaged by a politician. When is your content going to get engaged by a politician? When it aligns with one or another political point of view. Okay, so you have both platform first is what we call digital influencers and journalists who get way more than media houses. So media houses actually benefit from being slightly more in the middle. So you'll see even media houses which are seen as one or another end of the spectrum tend to have journalists from both sides. Yeah, but the individual journalists, they are going to go in different directions. So what we also did was, in the interest of time, I'll just skip through this, but part of our, so what we do is multiple things. So we did work with the data. We do a lot of interpretive work on YouTube videos, by which what I mean is we sit through YouTube videos and we look at what the person is saying, how they're sitting, how comfortable they are, etc. And we did a bunch of interviews with journalists to find out what is their impression of what it is like to be in journalism today. And I'm going to show you a couple of samples of this, and I'll read these out. So I was standing outside Patna AIIMS, which is the medical facility covering COVID crisis, wearing 3 layers of N95 masks. And this young boy in his early 20s come to me and says, who are you? What are you doing in our state? Why are you reporting from Bihar? I was like, your state is one of the worst affected states in the country right now. Asking me not to cover your state. Why? Because he thought that I'm anti-Bihar. Our Twitter timelines are filled with sexual attacks, and that really upsets me. And that took a toll on my mental health, and I stopped writing opinions. And one important thing which we've seen consistently is that female journalists get far more attacked than male journalists online. And the nature of that attack is extremely gendered. This is and this is across all ends of the political spectrum. You're right or left, you're going to get attacked with your body as a central part of how you're being attacked. Also, what is important is that the nature of the political discourse has become such that even reporting on something like COVID deaths is seen from the prism of, is it nationalistic to expose that people are dying, right? And the point here is that once you as a society get to a certain level of polarization, then any kind of reporting becomes dangerous. Any kind of reporting which shows the government in a specific light is going to start getting dangerous for you as a profession. Then there is something called the online disinhibition effect. Essentially, this is the person saying, these are real people. They hail from the same family backgrounds. They're talking about trolls that we come from, but they've chosen a slightly different path. If you meet them in person, they're normal people. They will talk about Modi, Yogi, Rahul Gandhi, and Arvind Kejriwal. They have fun, they have humor, they have aspirations. They want to, to climb this ladder. And a person from a lower middle class has joined a troll network. He has, they have targets. I have this MLA seat for my brother or myself. They're doing it for themselves. When it comes to social media, they're very toxic and aggressive. Even female trollers have this masculine vocabulary. If they're friends with any journalists or intellectual opposition party leaders, they will follow us, but they won't refrain from targeting us. The moment they go online, they behave as if they don't know us. Trolling has actually become a career option. If you become a serious troll and you get a significant amount of following online, you might very well get a ticket from a political party to fight elections, right? So the way tickets are distributed in India is the political party decides. There is no primary system, right? So as a result, we've seen many cases of people who nobody knew. Suddenly they became important online, and then some political party or the other gives them a ticket to fight the election. It's not necessarily true that they will win the election. In fact, if anything, the opposite is true. They're more likely to lose the election. But nonetheless, even being given a ticket to fight an election means you're able to translate what is an online form of power to a real physical form of power in society. And this online disinhibition effect has been studied across many, many Twitter studies, which shows basically that a person is going to say much more aggressive things online than they would to you in person, right? Now, in a summary, and there's actually a very, very interesting, there's a German philosopher who's worked on this notion of this spiral of silence. And the spiral of silence, the concept is, what is a topic that you will not discuss when you're sitting next to somebody in a train? Okay. And over time, when certain topics become more and more socially taboo, like politics or certain kinds of politics, you're going to move more and more topics into that spiral of silence, right? And in a sense, what we're seeing is that effect in India, where here, the more polarizing your content, the more you get engaged. Yeah. Media houses, like I said, that they have space in the center, but mainstream celebs and avoid edges. Like I said, again, that they have a problem with going there. And the digital influencers are the most polarizing. Most importantly, as I also said here, is that journalists increasingly need an online footprint to continue their careers. Now, this is the last section. And here I want to talk about the idea of political interviewing as a kind of canary to what is happening to the media ecology. The US primaries, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, in the US, a system of primaries that everybody goes and the primary, the place where a candidate declares that they want to stand for elections is a very important. So candidates are very careful about when they will go out and announce that they're going to stand for elections. And we found that in the US, several of the Republican candidates who announced their candidacy, their first meeting was with a YouTube influencer. Okay. And this is a complete change from the typical media side, where the first meeting often is on some kind of a stage in their home state with a television channel or something. Now they're moving to social media influencers. And we're seeing the same thing is happening in India. So one of the drivers of that is many of the journalists who were with mainstream television channels and found that they can't do their kind of journalism with mainstream television channels. I mean, one thing which has also been talked about a lot in India, especially, is that mainstream television channel gets the biggest advertiser in India is the government. So if you start saying things against the government, you lose your biggest advertiser. So most of the mainstream television tends to be government aligned, right? Now, what has happened is that the journalists who used to work for those channels have now started breaking away and making their own YouTube channels, right? And these journalists have increasingly become more viewed than some of the actual mainstream television channels in terms of the number of hits that they get. Okay. And of course, there's like a range of them, some of them for the nation, this is break the news, not the nation. Here's an example of a politician. Well, at this point, he's like been flushed down. So who did interviews both with a mainstream news channel anchor and with an influencer. And you can pretty much tell which one is which, right? So this is when he's with the mainstream news channel. He's got his party symbol. He's wearing his tikka, and there he's much more relaxed, and he's like kind of doing more of a kind of conversational thing. And this is important because the way we've understood politicians historically is we see them on a stage. We see them on television next to a presenter. Now you have this new way of seeing a politician in the same way as you and I do. This is the politician eating food. This is the politician playing with his children. This is the politician who can't handle spicy food. So you're humanizing them in certain ways. And also, the digital influencer who is interviewing the politician doesn't know policy. A professional journalist who is interviewing a politician will know what questions to ask. What is this going to impact? How does this differ from your past position? The digital influencer is going to ask them basic questions, but you leave that interview thinking positively about that policy which the person is talking about. So what we did is we mapped out how often the politicians would appear on digital, on mainstream news. The blue ones are mainstream news. The pluses and dots are simply opposition versus ruling party, and how often they will come on influencers or independent news. The important thing I want you to pay attention to is that the mainstream news channels tend to show up just before the election. Okay, so this is the timeline. Okay, but the longer term propaganda is happening through digital influencers. So what politicians do is on a daily basis, they keep showing up with an influencer, doing a little interview here and there. And that's your slow propaganda process. While just before the elections, that's when you start showing up with the mainstream news channels. And what is also interesting is that we looked at how much, again, this is just like a sampling of the most subscribed channels from each category. The most watched channel is actually belongs to an influencer. The most watched political interviews belongs to an influencer. And you have to see this guy's interviews to see just how basic they are. It's almost like the person is letting the politician come and say whatever they want and get away with it. And that kind of trend is actually moving upwards because politicians see that it's much more valuable to come to that, because what are you going to do going to a journalist where you know what that journalist's viewership is? If you know that this journalist generally attracts people who belong to this political perspective, you're not going to convert any voter there. What's the use? But if you go to a sports influencer, the sports influencer has followers who belong to all political persuasions. So you actually have a much more rational reason to go after people who do non-political things. So you can convert their followers, especially if you're doing this on a consistent basis throughout the year. Okay, so in summary, so what we're seeing is that anti-government, why did I have somehow managed to mess up that slide? So in conclusion, what I've tried to do with this talk is this is sort of like where my book ideas is trying to go as well, is make the argument that technology and the idea of technology as necessarily something which is aspirational and superior has been a big driver into why Indians have both actively subscribed to the idea of politicians and as technocrats, but over time also led to certain kind of behavioral changes around how we understand polarization itself. It is also interesting that Indian social media has now slowly started getting into the geopolitical game. So one of the things you might have noticed a lot is a lot of anti-liberal type of propaganda, which is moving around on Indian social media. So pictures of American cities where there are Black people committing some kind of petty crime and showing that, okay, see what Black people are doing around the world, this kind of thing. If we let liberals take over, this is going to happen to us. There is this very unusual kind of nexus between Indian social media behavior and what is happening in Israel and Gaza. And in fact, this was also largely reported in the news about how a lot of the Gaza trolls were coming out of India. And essentially, there's this kind of space of flows. The reason why India is important is because what is happening in India right now with social media is going to happen in other parts of the world. You might not believe me now, but you will soon enough. Why? Number one is that in the old days, if you were running a campaign of any kind in some part of Africa, your segue into bringing in a campaign staff would be from the former colonial capital. So the Senegalese would go to Paris, find an agency there. The Ghanaians would go to London, find an agency there. All that work has moved to Dubai. And Dubai is now where a lot of these things are being controlled from, just the agency work. And the agencies then subcontract work out to India. So what you have is that you see the William Ruto's campaign was designed by Indians. So you have South African campaigns, Nigerian campaigns, and Kenyan campaigns, all of which have been done by social media managers from India. So you have this kind of new space of flows where the Indian social media managers who've learned how to do this in India, how you manage the troll farms, etc., now consulting politicians in other parts of the world. So in a nutshell, this is my last slide. So social media affordances, basically, I'm making the claim that they pace up a certain kind of power concentration. There's also very good reasons to imagine that there's institutional factors playing in over here, is that if you are an incumbent which manages to stay in power long enough, one of the things that you can do is you can put pressure on Facebook to start towing your political line. We've seen this in action in a couple of countries already. Yeah. So there is this job of cultivation. You constantly kind of create a flow of content which is unabated, so that if you're doing the work of radicalization, you can't stop at any given point of time. You see a new mediatization. Narendra Modi started by not talking to the press in the first few campaigns. And even now when he talks to the press, it's a very controlled kind of environment. But what's important is that the opposition has done the same thing. So instead of the opposition saying, oh, we're going to embrace the press, the opposition also says, oh, we're not going to talk to the press anymore. We'll just talk to influencers as well. This is a real concern for democracy, is when all the politicians realize that we don't need to talk to journalists who will ask us difficult questions. Let's just talk to these characters who are going to give us an easy stance. Yeah. Finally, digital influencers can be much better controlled than a journalist or somebody who has a life outside of social media. You can't control a celebrity or a sports person in the same way or a digital influencer who only exists online. And of course, given that the digital influencer understands that as a politician, you bring them money, directly money by way of views. Your economic interest as a digital influencer is to stay aligned for this. So yeah, that's my talk.